This revolutionized cleaning and health and applied to our homes. It's a game changer. The Victorian nurse cleaning system, the fundamentals. Now, when I was in nursing school, there was one historical nurse I absolutely loved, Florence Nightingale. Florence was a Victorian nurse named after the city of Florence where she was born, who helped save thousands of lives using something surprisingly revolutionary yet simple: clean air, clean bedding, and clean environments. Because when she arrived at a military hospital during the Crimean War in the 1850s, soldiers were not mostly dying from battle wounds. They were dying from things like poor ventilation, overcrowding, contaminated environments. Victorian hospitals were not great. Think less Grey's Anatomy and more medieval Airbnb. Imagine a hospital room with no antibiotics, questionable plumbing, and dozens of patients packed in one ward. Now, suddenly that ER waiting room does not look so bad. Actually, as a former ER nurse, sometimes it was pretty bad. But Nightingale believes something that still matters today, and that is the environment around us can either help us heal or it can slowly make us sick, which I am always talking about food, water, and shelter, and this is shelter around us, your home, and that's why it matters. So today I'm trying something a little bit different. As a former Florence Nightingale fangirl who literally had a flow on the front of my nursing school binder, I am going to test some of her Victorian hygiene rules in my own home and see if they still make sense today. Now, I should probably mention that as a retired nurse, I am already a little hygiene aware, but it's actually really interesting to see how many of Florence Nightingale's ideas still make sense today, especially at home. Cat messed up my bed, and I don't think the Victorian nurses would approve of that. So we are just gonna fix it a little bit, make it look a little bit better. Victorian nurses were extremely focused on clean sheets and dry bedding. And Florence, our lovely lady with the lamp, as she was sometimes called, because she would walk around with a lamp at night, because nurses have to check on their patients. When she arrived at the military hospitals, many soldiers were lying in damp, dirty bedding for days at a time. And remember, these men were recovering from serious injuries, infections, and disease in crowded hospital wards. Sweat, blood, bodily fluids, and moisture, they built up quickly. So Nightingale pushed for something simple but powerful: frequent sheet changes, airing blankets, drying bedding in sunlight, and removing damp linens immediately, because moisture and filth created the perfect environment for infection. And Victorians were very serious about clean bedding anyway, which is awkward because I know some 18-year-olds out there are watching this and thinking, wait, we're supposed to wash sheets often? This is a safe space, sweetheart. We don't judge here. We try to help. I can assure you, though, this is actually pretty standard in the hospitals I worked in. It wasn't daily sheet changes for most people, but common. And yes, sometimes things slip through the crack, but you have to admire what good old Flo accomplished. And in modern science, they have realized that modern waste allows microbes to multiply way more rapidly. For example, bacteria can double every 20 minutes under ideal conditions. So the word dank fits in very well here. And removing waste quickly reduces bacterial growth and contamination. And bedding can accumulate a surprising amount of bacteria and dust mites. A study in Kingston University London found that pillowcases can contain thousands of times more bacteria than a toilet seat after 1 week. And dust mites, which thrive in bedding, are also a major trigger for asthma and allergies and skin irritation. So regular washing removes things like skin cells, bacteria, fungi, mites. And the good news is that most of those bacteria are harmless, but the bad news is that now you're thinking about them. So what I tried, or what we should all try, is this rule, is just improving the bedding situation. Washing bedding more frequently, airing out our blankets, which I love to do. It just reminds me of my grandma. Pulling the bedding back during the day so the mattress could dry out. I often will do that. I pull it back and I just let it dry, like air out for about an hour or so. So I'm actually pretty big on washing sheets. Before, when I was 22, I had a landlord and he asked me to stop doing so much laundry. because I was washing my sheets once a week, which I guess was too much. But honestly, there's nothing like getting into a fresh, clean bed. It's one of life's small luxuries. And I actually wondered how often they changed their sheets back then, because remember, they weren't throwing things in the washing machine and the dryer. Just imagine all of the sheets just blowing in the wind drying. It's kind of a nice thought, isn't it? When Florence, we'll call her Flo, arrived at military hospitals during the Crimean War in the 1850s, the wards were overcrowded and poorly ventilated. And the problem was not just discomfort, which would be pretty high. Disease spread incredibly quickly in those conditions. Soldiers were suffering from infections like typhus and cholera and dysentery and tuberculosis, and many of these illnesses thrive in crowded environments with poor sanitation and stale air. Flo believed that fresh air was the first rule of nursing, and she wrote, "The first canon of nursing is to keep the air the patient breathes as pure as the external air," which sounds really nice unless you have your summer forest fires like we do in BC and many of our surrounding neighbors have to deal with. Nightingale pushed for something radical at the time. She insisted on open windows and airflow through hospital wards, airing out bedding and rooms, because she believed that stagnant air made people sicker. And she even warned that breathing stale air was almost like breathing the fumes of a dung heap in the basement, which I feel a tiny bit called out by, because we do have our litter boxes in the basement, but you know, nobody is perfect. Now, in modern times, our indoor air pollution is actually now recognized as a major health issue. The WHO estimates 3.2 million deaths per year are linked to indoor air pollution, like cooking fumes, smoke, fuel exhaust, that they can not only cause more acute problems like CO poisoning or something, but it can lead to long-term diseases like cancer, especially in women. Now, indoor air can also be 2 to 5 times more polluted than outdoor air, according to the US EPA. And poor ventilation allows the buildup of mold spores in our houses, carbon dioxide, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, from household products like your new carpet or your paint or your bedding or whatever. And of course, airborne viruses. So today we know that ventilation plays a huge role in reducing the spread of infection. In fact, fresh air helps dilute, like it just dilutes the airborne viruses, reduces humidity that allows those darn microbes to thrive, and it lowers the concentration of indoor air pollutants that we talked about before. And studies now show that increasing ventilation can significantly reduce the transmission of airborne illnesses like TB and influenza. While Nightingale didn't know about germs yet, she correctly observed something important. Crowded, stale environments make disease spread faster. And I have actually been doing this a lot more this year. I have been opening up all of my windows and I absolutely love it. And I know a lot of people in Europe are like, why are you like, you're so surprised by this? I know. So creating cross ventilation, I'm opening all the doors and the windows and it's amazing. Just like 10 minutes. It's great to air out your bedding and the bedrooms, even in the winter. And Florence believed that fresh air mattered more than warmth. But somewhere out there is a dad yelling, "Close the door! We're not heating up the neighborhood!" Now, influenced by Nightingale's theories in the early 20th century open air movement, treated tuberculosis TB patients outside, requiring them to spend time on balconies, verandas, or in garden huts to breathe that fresh air. So back to Flo, one interesting statistic is that at the beginning of the Crimean War, the death rates in British military hospitals was estimated to be over 40%. But after sanitation and ventilation reforms, that number dropped dramatically. What could you do to bring more fresh air to your home? Oh, the sun, the glorious sun. Nightingale also believed sunlight was essential for healing. And keep in mind that science has come pretty far since back then, but she just knew something was up. She insisted that patients be placed near windows and natural light whenever possible. And during the Crimean War, many soldiers were recovering in dark, overcrowded hospital wards where air barely moved and sunlight rarely reached the beds. Nightingale insisted that patients be placed near windows and natural light. So she made sure beds were pushed up against long rows of windows and sunlight across the wards. She believed sunlight promoted healing and prevented disease, and that light itself prevent disease and support recovery. And while she didn't know about germs yet, she was obviously observing something very important, that sunlight changes the environment. It is not sunny here today, which makes me very sad because it turns out she was right. Modern science has showed us that ultraviolet light from the sun, it can damage and deactivate bacteria and viruses, which is why hospitals today, some of them actually use this really cool like UV light for sterilization. Super cool things. I've seen like, I mean, obviously like they clean everything, but then they like take it into like an OR or something. And I think it's cool. I don't even know where the research is. I haven't even looked it up lately, but it's so cool. Research published in the Journal of Hospital Infection found that hospital rooms with natural sunlight had significantly fewer viable bacteria than the darker rooms. But sunlight also supports our circadian rhythm, immune function, mood regulation, and the sun, which causes a positive mood, can improve health by triggering physiological behavior and psychological changes. So think about like how laughter therapy is so good. Sunlight therapy can promote recovery and reduce disease burden, particularly among those who are sick. So key mechanisms of how it helps us heal is that it lowers inflammation better. It also has better immune function and enhanced medication adherence, meaning people are more likely to take their medications, probably because they are feeling better. And it increases motivation to engage in healthy behaviors. How many times have you been like, it's beautiful out, I'm going to go for a walk. Meanwhile, today it's gloomy and blah, but maybe it would do me well to go for a walk anyway. But Nightingale believed dark, stagnant rooms made recovery harder, and no wonder. In modern times, think about all the people that work in cubicles in the middle of buildings. In fact, when I worked in the ER, we were in, actually it was cool, it did have like these center sort of like atriums, but it still did not really feel very bright. Like it was like you got there in the dark, you left in the dark. Not good. My mom, my poor mom, she lives on the ground floor of an apartment building facing a bank. It's very dark. Light is so important. So what I tried and continue doing is really prioritizing opening the curtains fully in the morning, like all around the house. And we have so many windows in this house. At one point I ordered new blinds and I think it was like 30 or something crazy like that. Unfortunately, it is gloomy here often, as I mentioned, but the daylight is so helpful when it is sunny. And I like to take full advantage by letting the sunlight hit the bedding, hit the floors, and I love to spend time in naturally lit rooms. Do you enjoy sitting in the sun? Even when it's gray out, do you feel like just getting the light is helpful? But don't you just find yourself like attracted to sitting in the sun? I find my cat sitting in the sun all of the time. Another rule Florence Nightingale insisted on was simple, and that is removing filth immediately. So when she arrived at the military hospitals during the war, the sanitation situation was shocking. Wounded soldiers were often surrounded by soiled bandages, bodily waste, dirty linens, leftover food, overflowing waste containers. And remember, this was happening in crowded wards with hundreds of patients. Under those conditions, infections spread rapidly, and diseases like cholera thrive in unsanitary conditions. Super deadly from loss of fluids, cholera is, and you can figure out how they're losing those fluids. It's from the top and the bottom, and it's really hard to replace it. It ain't pretty. And it and other illnesses thrive in environments where human waste and contaminated materials were allowed to accumulate. And on a side note, food left at room temperature can enter the danger zone for bacterial growth within 2 hours, according to food safety guidelines. I had to throw that out there for those 18-year-olds out there. All 2 of them that are going to watch this video about Victorian nursing cleaning systems, and I hate that I'm picking on you, but I am. So Nightingale enforced strict hygiene practices. Waste had to be removed quickly. Bandages had to be cleaned and replaced. Dry linens were taken away instead of sitting in the room, because once organic materials begin to break down, bacteria makes rabbits look like lazy in their reproduction. Today, we understand much more about how microbes spread, and she was on the money again. Poor sanitation is still responsible for many infections worldwide, while Nightingale didn't yet know about germ theory, she correctly observed something important, that dirty environments make people sicker. So what I tried for this rule is I focused on something very simple. And that was just like not letting dirty things sit around. I'm not terrible anyway, but I did make sure that dishes were dealt with as promptly as possible, kitchen scraps removed, the garbage was taken out every day, laundry handled sooner rather than later. And I found it helpful to revisit these things to help educate those around me, teenagers, because if we're honest, modern homes sometimes have their own version of medical waste. Leftover dishes in the sink, gym clothes sitting in a pile, and that mysterious Tupperware container in the back of the fridge that no one wants to open. You just go ahead and throw that away. Flo would not approve. For Nightingale, cleanliness was not something you did occasionally. It was constant maintenance. And one of the biggest enemies of cleanliness was dust. Dust was considered dangerous. Victorian nurses were obsessed about dust control. So when Florence Nightingale began reforming hospital wards during the Crimean War, she noticed that dirt and dust accumulated quickly in crowded rooms filled with wounded soldiers. Can you just imagine what it was like in those rooms? The beds were packed tightly together, the floors were dirty, air barely moved, and the dust from clothing, bedding, and the environment, it settled everywhere. So Nightingale insisted the hospital wards be kept scrupulously clean, especially the floors and the surfaces. Common practices included daily sweeping, wiping surfaces with damp cloths, minimizing fabric that trapped dust. Now, modern science research has confirmed that household dust is not just harmless fluff that we might have always thought it was. Dust contains things like, of course, skin cells, but bacteria, fungal spores, pollen, microplastic, heavy metals, and yes, a surprising amount of microplastic dust actually comes from synthetic fabrics and even clothing tumbling around in the dryer, which, great. A study published in Environmental Science and Technology found that household dust can contain dozens of environmental contaminants. Dust is also a major trigger for asthma, allergy, respiratory irritation, which of course makes Victorian nurses' obsession with dust control suddenly make a whole lot more sense. And here's what works: wiping surfaces regularly, focusing on high dust areas, which is like where a lot of activity is going to be, reducing clutter that traps dust, which leads to a big one. Be still, my heart. Florence warned that rooms filled with unnecessary objects were harder to keep clean. That's right, clutter was a problem, which means Victorian nurses would absolutely walk into some of our houses today and say, excuse me, but what is all of this? They would not be impressed with the Amazon situation. Florence recommended simple, orderly environments. Oh, Florence was a minimalist, you guys. Less clutter meant fewer places for dust to settle, which I am talking about all the time over here. Easier cleaning, calmer spaces for patients. And as we know in modern time, clutter can both affect physical and mental health. And studies show that cluttered environments can increase stress hormones, cognitive overload, feelings of anxiety, but clutter also traps dust and allergens, plus mold, etc. And you know that I'm always harping that asthma can be worsened by clutter, but it also poses a fall risk. And I am not about that. Again, in the ER, when people would come in with a broken hip or a broken shoulder or something, especially if they were a senior, that was a major thing. So what I tried in my house was revisiting my stuff, clutter and all. Always decluttering. You'd think I'd be done, but I'll never be done. I also like to make sure clearing surfaces off, removing unnecessary objects from the room, generally taking care of the stuff and not having like recycling getting dusty and all of the things. And of course, I was happier with less of that clutter around. Now, you knew this next one was coming from a former nurse, and that would be about lifestyle. Nightingale was famously strict about noise, which I love so much as a person that hates noise. She believed unnecessary sound harmed patients and slowed recovery, which makes me wonder what she would think of modern people falling asleep on watching crime documentaries on their iPhones. Probably would not be a fan. Hospitals were expected to remain calm and quiet, And the interesting thing is sleep is now recognized as one of the most important factors in healing and health overall. Poor sleep, it's linked to increased risk of heart disease, obesity, immune dysfunction. Studies show that hospital noise can significantly disrupt sleep and delay recovery, which is no surprise. Creating a calm environment, it supports both physical and mental health. And you all know I will always talk about how much I love the book Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. I will link it below. I have recommended this to a few people and they have been like, oh my gosh, this helped my sleep so much. Even for myself, it was a lifesaver. Plus, it is so interesting. And I love how he's like, us sleep researchers don't mind if you fall asleep while you're reading our book, which is kind of funny because it does kind of make you sleepy because they were talking about sleep so much, but it's such a good book. What I tried was reducing the noise in the evening because I like when it's not noisy anyway, but I was able to say to my family, we need a little bit quiet. I am researching for a video, you know. Also prioritizing a sleep environment, keeping it calm, keeping it peaceful. My bedroom, you saw I was standing in before. It is a very soothing place. Maintaining a calmer household rhythm is also really handy, especially at the end of the day. And telling my teenage son, who is on spring break, to go to bed at midnight because he is gaming with friends. And he's not shrieking the way my older son would when they were playing a game, but he's got a booming voice. Let's say that. So tell me, how is your sleep and what could you do to improve it? In the hospital, when people are in the hospital, I mean, we try to let people sleep, but it is not a great place to sleep. If you have ever tried to sleep there, let me know. The last time I stayed in the hospital as a patient, I think I had my third child, the one who's up at night right now. So that was like almost 17 years ago. And I was just outside the nurse's station, like they're trying, but nurses have to come in to check vitals in the middle of the night for all people. They need to, well, not all patients, but for many, they need to make sure people are alive, okay? Plus, sometimes people are delirious because they have an infection, surprisingly common. And some patients with dementia will get something called sundowning syndrome, which is like a restlessness that can be quite upsetting. Like their just mood will completely flip at like 7 or 8 p.m. And it is so disruptive, like upsetting for the patient and very disruptive for the floor. So fresh air, sunlight, clean bedding, order, rest. Florence Nightingale, she believed those things could save lives. And after trying her rules at home, I'm starting to think she might have been right. Actually, the germaphobe in me definitely thinks that she was. And interestingly, a lot of these same principles show up in traditional communities today. And I actually explored that in another video looking at Amish cleaning habits in how their homes stay so orderly and healthy. So check that out here if you like. I hope something great happens for you today. Please like and subscribe if you are one of the 60% of viewers who are not subscribed. So please join the family. Stay tidy and mighty. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.